In the small countryside town of Monte Azul, life moves slowly. Nestled between rolling hills and endless cornfields, it's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked. For decades, nothing much ever happened here. Until the night of December 15, 2004. That night was supposed to be a celebration. The local school was holding its annual graduation dance, a tradition that brought together students, parents, and teachers. For the teenagers of Monte Azul, it was their first real taste of adulthood. 3 of them, however, would have their fates changed forever: Eduardo, Luísa, and Marcelo. Eduardo was 15, a quiet boy with kind eyes. He lived with his grandmother. Luísa was his first girlfriend, a girl with curly hair who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Marcelo was Luísa's best friend, a tall, goofy boy, the son of a single mother who worked double shifts to give him a better life. That night, all 3 were seen leaving the dance together around midnight. Witnesses said they were laughing, holding hands, walking toward the old road. It was the last time they were ever seen. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. 3 young people vanished. The small town of Monte Azul would never be the same. This is the story of that night, the secrets that were buried, and the truth that finally came to light. The morning after the dance, the first person to raise the alarm was Dona Celia, Luísa's mother. When she went to wake her daughter, she found the bed empty. At first, she thought Luísa might have stayed at a friend's house. But when she called around and discovered no one had seen her, panic began to set in. The police were called, and within hours, the entire town was mobilized. The police chief at the time was Delegado Valadares, a man who had never handled anything more serious than a stolen bicycle. He assured the families that everything possible was being done. Search parties were organized. Volunteers combed through the forests, checked abandoned farms, and knocked on every door for miles. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew over the region for days. But there was nothing. No trace of the 3 teenagers was ever found. Eduardo's grandmother waited by the window day and night. Marcelo's mother kept her son's room exactly as he left it, hoping he would walk through the door at any moment. Dona Celia, however, refused to wait passively. She began her own investigation, visiting nearby towns, posting flyers, begging anyone with information to come forward. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, hope began to fade. The case grew cold. The police eventually labeled it as a possible runaway situation, a theory that devastated the families. Without bodies, without witnesses, without evidence, there was nothing to be done. Life in Monte Azul slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but the shadow of that night never truly lifted. 20 years passed. Monte Azul changed, as small towns do. Some people left, others arrived. New houses were built. The children who were once teenagers became adults with families of their own. The case of the 3 missing teenagers faded into local legend, a story told to newcomers. But for the families, the pain never faded. It just became a part of who they were. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March of 2024, something extraordinary happened. A man stepped off the bus at the town's small terminal. He was thin, disheveled, with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He wore worn-out clothes and carried a small plastic bag. The ticket agent, a young woman who had grown up hearing the stories, looked at his face and froze. She recognized him from the old photographs that still hung in the town's small museum. It was Eduardo. The boy who disappeared 20 years ago was back. Word spread faster than fire. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered. People whispered, pointed, and stared. Some cried. Others looked at him with suspicion. Eduardo didn't speak much. He just stood there, looking around at the town he had left behind, his expression unreadable. When someone asked him where he had been all these years, he simply shook his head and said, "I don't remember." When asked about Luísa and Marcelo, his face went pale, and he turned away. The police were called. Delegado Valladares, now 62 and close to retirement, arrived at the scene. He looked at Eduardo, and for a moment, even the seasoned officer seemed shaken. The case was being reopened. Eduardo was taken to the police station for questioning, but the interview went nowhere. He claimed to have no memory of the night he disappeared or the years that followed. He said his first clear memory was waking up on a park bench in a city he didn't recognize about 6 months ago. Since then, he had been wandering, trying to piece together who he was and where he came from. It was only when he saw a news report about Monte Azul that something clicked, and he decided to return. The officers didn't know what to believe. Trauma could cause memory loss, they knew that. But something about Eduardo's demeanor felt off. He avoided eye contact. He flinched at sudden movements. When asked about Luísa and Marcelo, his hands trembled uncontrollably. Meanwhile, the news of Eduardo's return reached a woman named Amanda. She was a journalist from the state capital who had moved to Monte Azul 6 months earlier seeking a quieter life. She had heard the story of the 3 teenagers shortly after arriving, and it had stuck with her. Now, with one of them back, she sensed the story of a lifetime. She requested access to the old case files and spent days reading through yellowed papers, faded photographs, and witness statements. The more she read, the more convinced she became that there was more to this story than anyone knew. The police had labeled it a runaway case, but the evidence suggested otherwise. These were happy kids with close families and bright futures. Why would they run? And if they did run, why did only one come back? Amanda decided to investigate on her own. Amanda's first step was to visit Dona Celia, Luísa's mother, who still lived in the same small house on the edge of town. Now in her 60s, Dona Celia had never stopped hoping for answers. Her living room was a shrine to her daughter, photographs on every surface, candles that she lit every night, and a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about the case. When Amanda introduced herself and explained that she wanted to help, Dona Celia broke down in tears. "Finally," she said. "Finally, someone who wants the truth." Over the next several days, Dona Celia shared everything she remembered. She talked about Luísa's final weeks, how she had seemed quieter than usual, distracted, as if something was weighing on her mind. She remembered her daughter spending a lot of time with Eduardo and Marcelo, the 3 of them always whispering together. She assumed it was just teenage stuff, crushes and secrets. But now she wondered if it was something more. Then Dona Celia did something that would change everything. She went to her bedroom and returned with a small box. Inside was an old diary, its cover worn and pages yellowed. "This was Luísa's diary," she explained. "The police never saw it. I couldn't bear to give it to them. I was afraid they wouldn't take it seriously. But now, maybe it can help." Amanda took the diary with trembling hands. She opened it to the final entry, dated December 14, 2004, the day before the disappearance. As she read the words, her blood ran cold. Luísa had written about something she and her friends discovered. Something about a family in town. Something that troubled them deeply. And she wrote that if anything ever happened to her, people should know what they had found. Amanda looked up at Dona Celia. "This is it," she said. "This is where we start." The diary entry was carefully written, but between the lines, Amanda could feel Luísa's concern. The girl wrote about overhearing a conversation at a local store, something about workers being kept in poor conditions on a farm outside town. At first, she thought it was just gossip, but then she mentioned it to Eduardo, and his reaction surprised her. "He looked scared," she wrote. "Really scared. He made me promise not to tell anyone. But I can't stop thinking about it. Marcelo says we should investigate. He says if it's true, we have to do something. Tomorrow night, after the dance, we're going to check it out. Just to see if it's real. I'm scared, but I'm also angry. How can people do this to other people? If something happens to us, please know that we were trying to do the right thing." The farm wasn't named in the diary, but Luísa mentioned that it belonged to the father of one of their classmates, a boy named Ricardo. Amanda knew that name. Ricardo was now a city councilman, one of the most powerful men in the region. His family had owned large tracts of land for generations. They were respected, influential. Ricardo's father, however, was long dead, which meant that if there was any truth to Luísa's words, the evidence might be buried with him. But Amanda wasn't deterred. She began digging into the history of the family, looking for old news reports, land records, anything that might connect them to the accusations. What she found was disturbing: multiple reports of workers who had fled the farm over the years, complaints filed with labor authorities that were never resolved, and rumors that never quite became scandals. The pieces were starting to come together. Amanda knew she needed to talk to Eduardo, but he had become reclusive since returning to town. He was staying in his grandmother's old house, which had been abandoned for years and was now barely habitable. Neighbors reported seeing him only at night, walking alone through the streets. Some were sympathetic, believing he was a victim. Others were suspicious, wondering what he really knew about that night. Amanda approached the house cautiously. It was a small, dilapidated building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. She knocked and waited. After a long moment, the door creaked open. Eduardo stood there, looking thinner and more haunted than he had in the photographs she'd seen. His eyes were hollow, his expression guarded. Amanda introduced herself and explained that she was investigating the case. She mentioned the diary and watched his reaction carefully. At the mention of Luísa's name, his face contorted with pain. He tried to close the door, but Amanda was faster. "Please," she said. "Her mother has waited 20 years for answers. If you know anything at all, you owe it to her to speak." Eduardo stopped. For a long moment, he stood frozen. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and let her in. The inside of the house was sparse: a mattress on the floor, some canned food on a shelf, and stacks of newspapers that Eduardo had apparently been reading. They sat across from each other in the dim light. For a long time, Eduardo said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. Eduardo's story came out in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled. He spoke of that night, December 15, 2004, with a clarity that surprised even himself. The three of them left the dance around midnight, just as witnesses had said. They walked down the old road toward the farm that belonged to Ricardo's father. Luísa had insisted they go. She said if there really were people being held in poor conditions there, they had a moral duty to find out. Marcelo, always the brave one, agreed immediately. Eduardo went along because he couldn't let them go alone. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The farm was about 3 miles outside town, a sprawling property surrounded by fences and dense woods. They approached from the back, using a path that Eduardo knew from his childhood. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. They crept through the trees until they reached a clearing where they could see the main buildings. What they saw shocked them. There were people there, yes. But they looked tired and worn, moving slowly. They were surrounded by men. Eduardo wanted to run, to call the police, to do anything but stay. But Marcelo had already pulled out his camera, a cheap disposable thing he'd brought to document everything. He was taking pictures, trying to capture evidence. And then, a twig snapped under Luísa's foot. The men turned. Flashlights swept through the darkness. And then they were running for their lives through the woods, branches cutting their skin, terror driving them forward. Eduardo could hear Luísa's breath beside him, could hear Marcelo calling out. And then he heard something else. A shout. A struggle. And then a loud sound that echoed through the night like a thunderclap. Eduardo kept running. He ran until his legs gave out, until he collapsed at the side of a road, hours later, miles away. When he finally looked back, Luísa and Marcelo were gone. Eduardo was picked up by a truck driver at dawn. He was in shock, barely able to speak. The driver, a kind man named Sebastião, took him to a city hundreds of miles away and tried to get him help. But Eduardo couldn't explain what had happened. The trauma had already begun to bury the memories, replacing them with a blank wall of nothing. For the next 2 decades, he drifted. He lived on the streets, worked odd jobs when he could, and never stayed in one place for long. He had no identity documents, no family connections, no past. He was a ghost, wandering through a world that didn't know he existed. The memories stayed buried until a few months before his return. Something triggered them, he wasn't sure what. Maybe a news report, maybe a face in a crowd. Slowly, painfully, the images began to surface. The farm. The loud sound. The faces of his friends. He couldn't stay away any longer. He had to come back, even if he didn't know what he would find. Amanda listened to this story in stunned silence. When Eduardo finished, tears were streaming down his face. "I should have gone back," he said. "I should have tried to find them. I've carried this guilt for 20 years. Amanda reached out and took his hand. "You were a child," she said. "You did what you had to do to survive. But now, you can help us find the truth." She asked him about the farm, about Ricardo's father, about anything else he remembered. Eduardo thought hard. "The man who ran the place," he said. "He was older, with gray hair. I heard one of the guards call him Seu Otavio. That was Ricardo's father. Otavio was his name." Amanda nodded, making mental notes. She had what she needed. Now she just had to prove it. Amanda knew that confronting Ricardo directly would be difficult. He was a powerful man with connections throughout the region. If she accused him without solid evidence, she could be sued, discredited, or worse. She needed to find the farm, or what was left of it, and see if any evidence remained after all these years. She enlisted the help of a friend from her journalist days, a man named Paulo who now worked as a private investigator. Together, they drove out to the old farm, which had been abandoned since Otavio's death 10 years earlier. The property was overgrown, the buildings crumbling, but something about the place still felt eerie. They searched for hours, finding nothing but rusted equipment and empty sheds. But as they were about to give up, Paulo noticed something. A patch of ground near the woods looked disturbed, as if it had been dug up and refilled more recently than the rest. They didn't have tools to dig, but they marked the spot and returned the next day with shovels. What they found would make anyone's heart sink. Buried in a shallow grave were human remains. 2 sets of them. One smaller, one larger. Amanda's hands shook as she called the police. Within hours, the farm was swarming with investigators. Forensics teams carefully exhumed the remains and began the process of identification. It would take weeks to get DNA results, but Amanda already knew in her heart who they were. She thought of Dona Celia, waiting all these years, and hoped that this discovery would bring her some measure of peace, even if it was the peace of knowing rather than the agony of wondering. The discovery of the remains sent shockwaves through Monte Azul. News crews descended on the small town. Reporters camped outside the police station, the farm, and the homes of everyone connected to the case. Ricardo, now a respected city councilman, issued a statement expressing shock and sadness, and offering his full cooperation with the investigation. But Amanda wasn't buying it. She knew that Otavio couldn't have acted alone. Someone must have helped him cover up what happened, dispose of the remains, and keep the secret for 20 years. That someone might still be alive, still powerful, still dangerous. Amanda began digging into Ricardo's past. She discovered that on the night of the disappearance, Ricardo had claimed to be sick at home. But a former classmate, now living in another state, told Amanda something different. She remembered seeing Ricardo's car near the farm that night. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, looking back, she was certain. Amanda also found a former employee of the farm, a man named Jose, who had worked there in 2004. Jose was old and sick now, living in a nursing home, but his mind was still sharp. When Amanda mentioned the case, his eyes widened with fear. "I can't talk about it," he whispered. "They'll hurt me." But after much persuasion, he finally agreed to speak. He told Amanda about the night Otavio came to him in a panic, ordering him to help bury 2 bodies in the woods. Jose was terrified, but he did as he was told. He'd carried the guilt ever since. Now, finally, he could unburden himself. He gave Amanda a detailed statement, including the exact location of the graves, which matched what she had already found. It was the break she needed. Armed with Jose's testimony and the discovery of the remains, Amanda went to the state prosecutor's office. She presented everything she had: Luisa's diary, Eduardo's account, the witness who saw Ricardo's car, and Jose's confession. The prosecutor listened carefully, then opened a formal investigation into Ricardo and anyone else involved in the disappearance of Luísa and Marcelo. A warrant was issued for Ricardo's arrest. When the police arrived at his home, he was packing his suitcase, apparently preparing to leave. He was taken into custody without resistance, but his face told a story of desperation. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including DNA from the remains that matched Luísa and Marcelo. Jose testified about the night of the burial, his voice shaking with emotion. Eduardo took the stand and described, for the first time in public, the events of that night. Ricardo's defense tried to paint him as a victim of his father's actions, a young man who had no choice but to go along with the cover-up. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all charges. Ricardo was sentenced to 35 years in prison for his role in the cover-up. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the courtroom, at the faces of the families he had helped keep in the dark for so long. For the families of Luísa and Marcelo, the verdict brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the truth had finally come out. But also a profound and enduring grief. No conviction could bring their children back. No sentence could undo the 20 years of not knowing. Dona Celia visited the site where her daughter's remains were found for the first time, a simple ceremony attended by friends and neighbors. She placed flowers on the ground and spoke softly to the daughter she had lost. "I always knew you'd come home," she said. "I just wish it could have been different." Marcelo's mother, Dona Fatima, had a harder time. She had spent 2 decades hoping her son would walk through the door. Accepting that he was gone felt like losing him all over again. But she found some comfort in the knowledge that his bravery in trying to expose the truth had inspired others to seek justice. His story would not be forgotten. As for Eduardo, the return of his memories and the resolution of the case brought a strange kind of peace. He was still haunted, still processing what he had experienced. But he was no longer running. He decided to stay in Monte Azul, to rebuild his life in the place where it had all begun. With the help of Amanda and others, he found a small apartment and a job at a local store. He visited Dona Celia often, and together they remembered Luísa, sharing stories and keeping her memory alive. It wasn't a happy ending, not really. But it was an ending, and sometimes that's enough. Amanda's investigation didn't stop with Ricardo's conviction. She continued to dig, uncovering more about the conditions that had existed on that farm for so long. She found evidence that local officials had ignored complaints, that workers' rights had been violated, that people had been silenced. Her reporting led to a broader investigation into labor practices in the region, exposing conditions that shocked the nation. Several other farms were inspected, and changes were demanded. The story of Luísa, Marcelo, and Eduardo had sparked a movement. It had forced people to look at the dark corners of their communities and ask hard questions about who profited from silence. Amanda wrote a book about the case, titled "The Night We Stopped Running." It became a bestseller, read by millions who were moved by the courage of 3 teenagers and the determination of a journalist who refused to let their story die. She donated a portion of the proceeds to organizations that fought for workers' rights, ensuring that Luísa and Marcelo's legacy would live on in meaningful action. But for Amanda, the most important thing was that the truth had been told. In a world where powerful people so often escape accountability, this was a rare victory. She thought often of that night in 2004, of 3 kids who set out to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price. They were heroes, she believed. Not because they were special or chosen, but because they were ordinary people who refused to look away from injustice. And that, she thought, was the most heroic thing of all. Today, Monte Azul is a different place. The town has a small memorial in the central square, a simple stone bench with a plaque bearing the names of Luísa and Marcelo. On the anniversary of their disappearance, people gather there to light candles and remember. Eduardo is often among them, standing quietly, his presence a living reminder of what happened and what was overcome. He still doesn't talk much, but when he does, he speaks of his friends with a love that time has not diminished. "They saved me," he sometimes says. "Not just that night, but every day since. They gave me a reason to come back." The case became a symbol, not just for Monte Azul, but for the entire country. It showed that no matter how much time passes, no matter how powerful the people involved, the truth has a way of surfacing. It showed that ordinary citizens, armed with determination and courage, can challenge systems of corruption and win. And it showed that the voices of those we've lost, if we listen closely enough, can still speak to us across the years. For Dona Celia, for Dona Fatima, for Eduardo, and for everyone who lived through those 20 years of uncertainty, the secret of prom night was finally revealed. The healing could begin. It would take time, maybe a lifetime. But it could begin. And in that, there was hope. Because as long as we remember, as long as we tell the stories, as long as we refuse to let the truth be buried, justice is always possible. Always.